All right, guys. So, um, what I want to do today was um, give a lecture, or at least try to cover a little bit of the material from your reading for this week. I felt like maybe last week I didn't really do much with covering a lot of the specifics in the book. I'm going to try to do a little bit more with it this time around because I feel like the subject matter probably appeals to you a little bit more. I also want to talk a little bit about Suzanne Romaine's article, Gender Talk, because I think it also actually fits in its own way with chapter 8, which is masculinity in music. One of the reasons why this is a chapter that I really like is I'm a pretty big music file. Um, I don't want to say you name the genre of music and I know it. I don't want to be that presumptuous, but chances are, if it's something that's been considered popular music from probably the late '60s to probably at least the early 2000s, I probably there's a chance I probably know it and probably know it pretty well. So one of the things I want us to kind of think about is the way your chapter is laid out, talking about masculinity in music and not just how maybe it has evolved in the sense that maybe what we view as being masculine has changed, but also um, genres of music that maybe were not around in, say, the 1950s or 60s that are around now um, have a completely different connotation of masculinity because the world we live in now is a lot different than it was 50 or 60 years ago. um, your book tends to kind of start out, I think, again, me kind of weeding through it, kind of tended to start out with probably the blues. And again, you got to remember, this book is talking about America. This book is about American culture for the most part. So they're talking about American music. Um, Really, I mean, as far as being recorded music that people were, um, I don't want to necessarily say they were buying the records to, but as far as like recorded music that was being played on radio or that people used to go to, now they're called clubs. They used to be called juke joints, and dancing to and listening to were the blues. And so the blues, if you listen to it, it has a certain masculine um, appeal to it. Almost all the songs are about hard living, hard drinking. The original blues, is, as most people know, or at least should, was African American. The sound came from Africa, and most of the original practitioners were African American. So that's not to say that there weren't guys around at that time who were playing um, either similar music who weren't black, but the originators of it were, for the most part, were African Americans. The instrumentation, a lot of the instrumentation came from Africa. Some of it came from Europe. For example, like though it's not considered as being probably a prototypical um, a blues instrument, banjos actually were, I believe they were actually Scottish, but very similar instruments also came over from Africa. So, again, to say that it was one or the other is probably not accurate. It's probably more like it was a hybrid. But the sounds that each ethnic group would have been producing, notice my little guitar gesture there, um, would have been totally different, and the things they would have been singing about were probably going to be a lot different. Um, More than likely, if you were to listen to, say, an Irish or a Scottish guy in the early 20th century playing a song, it would have been like an ode to his homeland. Whereas a lot of the blues guys, they weren't, they weren't writing songs about Africa. They were writing about stuff that's very much embedded in like American culture. Like I said, hard living, hard drinking, chasing women, things that we still view as being very masculine. Robert Johnson. I mean, the devil went. They called him the devil. That was his sort of his moniker. And in fact, he may have actually done the original Devil Went Down to Georgia. That might have been him. Charlie Daniels made that into a country song probably like 50 years later. I think Robert Johnson was the one that originated that song. But where I'm going with it is, a lot of times when we look at American culture, I think we're very quick to assume that, the sort of values and beliefs and ideologies that were set into place were always set into place by white people, by Europeans, because they were the first people that were really settlers here. I mean, now back up. Yes, there were Native Americans. What I said there was they were the first settlers here. Okay. So what I mean was, because they came in and they outnumbered Native Americans, their culture sort of predominated over anything that the Native Americans culturally had in place. Okay. So I am not saying that the white people were the first people here. Believe me, I'm not saying that. And I wouldn't want people thinking that, because I'm a white guy, that's what I think. I know that's not the case. And we all know that the unfortunate way that Africans ended up here, and with them, the point I'm making is they brought their own traditions too. And so I don't think a lot of times, I think if you took Gender Studies 303, which I'm also teaching right now, one of the things they talk about in that book is, sort of masculinity in the South during the slave era, and about how it was very difficult for slaves to be to have any real masculinity, because when somebody owns you, it's very hard to kind of be an autonomous person. And most of us think that being autonomous and independent, that's the first sign of being either a masculine man or a feminine woman. Those are like key things. Like, people controlling what you do, it tends to kind of strip you of that. And I think this is where I'm going with this. I think a lot of people forget that, just because slaves had to keep a lot of what they did a secret doesn't mean that it disappeared. Again, one of the things I talk about when I teach English class is the oral tradition. Well, the English language began, I'm sorry, I have a runny nose, pollen. The English language began long ago. Those of you guys who've taken me for 231 will remember this. Beowulf is probably considered to be the first, like Anglo-Saxon story that's documented. Well, that story originated in the oral tradition. And not to go off topic, but those of you guys who had me for a teacher before know that the story that somebody found a half-written manuscript of Beowulf, and they finished it. I almost want to call them archaeologists, because that's almost what they are at that point. But expert literary critics, and probably, again, people with an archaeological background who can look at those things, almost like a forensics background. They looked at that manuscript and knew that it was written by two different hands at two different times. So the point of the matter is obviously that story had been told enough orally that whoever picked that book up and found that story half finished was able to finish it, because the story was so well circulated. They knew how to finish the story. Okay. Well, same thing with slave stuff. They were not taught, at least not initially anyway. I'm not going to say every slave master was the same, but for the most part, watch the movie Roots, watch the miniseries Roots. There's a reason why slaves were kept ignorant, because the more ignorant you keep people, the less power you give them. That's why they weren't taught how to read and write, because to give people knowledge is to give them power. Okay. Well, guess what? Sooner or later, whether they were taught or whether they just learned it, African Americans became literate. And those things that were originally just oral histories and oral stories became written down. So a lot of the original blues music, it had actually been circulated around orally long before any of those guys wrote the stuff down. So what I'm telling you is, blues music has a real historical background to it. And again, it's I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Its cultural significance in a masculine sense is that African American males had to forge their own sense of masculinity in the face of a dominant culture that didn't want to allow them to do that. So how they did it was through oral stories and through being secretive. And then when it came time for someone like a Robert Johnson to be able to break out his guitar and play and make these things that have been in the oral tradition public, people listened to it and they were like, oh, damn. They were like, that's, and again, like if you look later on at a lot, particularly if you look around probably like the 60s, and I'm strictly referencing the blues here. There were a group of guitar players who actually, a lot of them were English, believe it or not. The group that actually began by sort of, what's the word I want to use, squelching black customs, ended up embracing them. Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, American guy, Jimi Hendrix. Later on, even like from Australia, Angus Young, AC/DC's guitarist. Jeff Beck, English guitar player. Those guys' styles, and they would admit it, are highly indebted to African American blues. ZZ Top. Now they're American. ZZ Top's another group. In fact, something kind of funny to talk about cross cultures. Even though they were both American, Jimi Hendrix, while he was alive, said that I think ZZ Top's guitarist is named Frank Beard. He said ZZ Top's guitarist was his favorite guitar player. That's what Jimi Hendrix said. So, I mean, like, that's pretty high praise. So, I mean, when you look at how many people would look at Jimi Hendrix and say, wow, that guy was my inspiration to play, that's pretty high praise. I know like Slash from Guns N' Roses is another newer. And I realize, like, to you guys, these guys aren't new, but you have to remember in the pantheon of American music, he's still considered fairly new. I mean, late 20th century. Slash, I believe, was another one who said he got a lot of his sound from Jimi Hendrix. Like that was kind of who he modeled. And so the point I'm making is, masculinities in this sense of music particularly had a way of crossing over cultural boundaries. So in some ways, and I don't know that your book necessarily talks a whole lot about it, but in some ways, music really had a way of bringing races together as opposed to being something that kept them apart. And I know that's going to sound weird, but let's look into like a genre that most of you are probably more familiar with. Let's look at hip hop. Now, hip hop is the culture. Rap is the music that came from it. Okay. Now there's a difference. Okay. Again, I'm not going to beat you to death with that. That's something that I've written stuff on and I know a lot about. Me and any of y'all who ever had Dr. Proctor Walden as a teacher, me and her have debates all the time about the best MCs. If we could put together a Mount Rushmore, who would be on it? Why nowadays hip hop is sort of kind of in a lot of ways lost a step. I mean, me and her will go back and forth about this. I respect her opinion and I think she respects mine. Just because it happens to be something that I have read a lot about and I know a lot about. But if we want to go back and look, when you look at probably that original kind of first wave of rappers that came in, what you're going to hear probably most people talk about are like Africa Bambaataa, Planet Rock. Okay, now if you guys listen to that, I mean, seriously, a lot of you may not even know what that is. If you get on YouTube and you look up Africa Bambaataa, Planet Rock, it's not really rap the way that you all know it, but it was getting close to rap. Okay, you would probably Kool Herc was probably one of the first. Marley Marl, Juice Crew. Then you would get into guys who started getting a little more notoriety, i.e. Grandmaster Flash, Furious 5. If you guys don't know the song The Message, you know nothing about rap music. I'm sorry, I've told my students that before. If you do not know that song, you have no business discussing rap music. Okay, period. You don't. If you don't know the video, you've never heard the song, or you don't know of the song, you need to go watch it. Okay, where am I going with this idea of bringing things together? Okay, well, probably around 1985, 1986. And again, I'm telling you stuff that's not in your book. I'm just building off stuff that's kind of in your book. 1985, 86, Def Jam Records started. And that was Russell Simmons' record label. When he started Def Jam, obviously, he needed talent to put on Def Jam. He needed people to put on there. And he also needed producers. He hired a white guy named Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin worked with one of the first groups that Russell Simmons brought onto Def Jam, and that was Run DMC. Now, again, if y'all don't know Run DMC, then you know nothing about your rap history, okay? If you listen to Run DMC, one of the things you're going to notice is there's a lot of guitar infusion in their songs, okay? The reason that is because Rick Rubin was a rock producer. Rick Rubin, as I recall, in the 70s, he had produced a lot of like rock bands. So naturally, his inclination was rock music. How can we put rock music in here and infuse it with these bass beats and make it work? And then you have a song like Rockbox. I only use Rockbox as an example because it's probably one of Run DMC's better known songs. But I mean, to give you a hint of like, if you've never heard it, don't know it, the refrain of it is almost kind of like a dun, 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 da, 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 dun, 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 da, 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 da. And it just kind of does that over and over again. It's like a loop. Okay. It's like in a rock song, when a guy does when a rock guitarist is playing that sort of like the loop part. That's basically what they did, but with a track. They put that on like a track, and then they would just loop it on a track and put a beat on it. Okay. Now, not just Rick Rubin being important, though he was. Rick Rubin also went on to produce 99 Problems. That was Jay-Z, a Jay-Z song. Okay. The reason why that is another one that has a lot of guitar in it is because Rick Rubin did that. Okay. The Beastie Boys, hugely important in the history of rap. And again, I'm not telling you that because I'm a white guy and the Beastie Boys are white, because honestly, like, I like the Beastie Boys, but they're not one of my favorite bands or anything. But they're important because what they showed was that white guys could gain credibility in that genre of music, because particularly at the time, they were highly respected. Like, they were going out on tour with the mega rap groups. And they were highly respected. They were just Jewish guys from New York. And if you listen to their songs or watch their videos, which again, now that we're going virtual, see, I can tell you this stuff. I can't show it to you while I lecture, but I can tell you to go look at it so you can see it for yourself. Go watch a video like You've Got to Fight for Your Right to Party by the Beastie Boys. Okay. Not only are you going to get the massive guitar licks in there, but the whole video is basically guys at a party being hyper masculine, chasing women, picking on nerds. It's just a stereotyped masculine party atmosphere. It looks like a frat party, and basically they're just terrorizing the party. I'm trying to think of any other song videos, at least. Their older videos aren't necessarily coming to me, but they had a lot of those songs that had they were one of the groups that started sampling. And again, another group that really inherited a blues sound that was an English group was Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page was their lead guitarist. Jimmy Page inherited a lot of his sound from the black blues players. Excuse me. One of the more well-known songs off the Beastie Boys album, License to Ill, which I think was their first album, is She's Crafty. She's Crafty uses a sampled loop from a Led Zeppelin song called The Ocean. And so again, what I'm talking about is basically, it's almost like there's it's almost like a triangulation. You start out with the black blues, you go to the white guy impersonating the black blues, then you go to the rapper who's using the beats from the white blues guy who stole them from the black guy. So you're getting at, it's almost like a triangulation. And of course, music video coming in too. And I don't know how much your book really touched on this. Music video really allowed for a lot of, I would say, a very large cross section of people to express their own gender the way they felt like they should. I mean, great example. And your book didn't talk a lot about him, and I was kind of surprised because I did read the chapter. I'm amazed Elton John wasn't talked about. Elton John was extremely flamboyant to the point where I don't think and you got to remember now, when Elton John was like super popular, I wasn't even born yet. Okay. So he was popular in the 70s. Elton John, I'm not going to sit here and say his music was ever hyper masculine. Not much of it, at any rate. I wouldn't call it that. And I wouldn't say he was hyper masculine. I think instead, what your book overlooks is that I don't think Elton John, at least when he was popular, I don't think he ever came out and admitted that he was gay, or now I believe he actually claims bisexuality. But I don't think he ever came out and admitted that in the 70s, because I think there was such a stigma around being gay that he worried that, one, how would that affect how people viewed him, even though I think a lot of people probably assumed he was because of the way he behaved. Again, gender roles, the way he dressed, the way he presented himself. And I think that he worried about how not only would that affect like a public perception of him, but how that would affect sales of his records. Because, if people were like, well, we don't like gay people, well, they're probably not going to buy your records. And the thing about Elton John that would have made that an absolute tragedy is that he's such a great musician. Again, like, if you guys don't know Elton John, I mean, just go online and listen to a couple of his songs. I mean, the guy is unbelievable. The guy is unbelievable. He doesn't do much now, and I heard actually he'd been sick. I heard he had to cancel some tour dates. But as far as like when he was in his prime, quiet as kept. Again, not advocating any of this. But supposedly this was a true story about how gifted he was as a songwriter. He had such a drinking and drug problem that what he would do was, and the thing that was, it's not funny, it's almost sad. And again, here's another masculine thing: drinking and drugs. You know, a lot of people think drinking and drug, you know, binge drinking, drug use, those are things that make you masculine. Well, for Elton John, clearly, one, he wasn't doing it for that. He wasn't doing it for that because he wasn't doing it in public. That was a big thing. Elton John, when you're wealthy and you have connections, you can get things. Okay. Elton John, when it came time for him to make an album, this is a story I have heard more than once. He would go to like his manager and tell him, get me a brick of cocaine and a handle, like a big half-gallon bottle of scotch. And I'm going to retreat to this room in his mansion. And when I'm done with the coke and I'm done with the scotch, I'm going to come out and what I have is what I have. And they would say, you know, he would go in there and it would be like 2 days, something like that. I'm going to pull out a number, 2-3 days. And what he would do was he'd emerge from the room 2 or 3 days later, obviously looking like hell, you know, like not sleeping, because obviously like you're doing that much cocaine, you're probably not going to sleep. Again, not getting into that, this is not, of course, about drugs. But what I'm getting at is he was so concentrated on what he was doing. And he was so talented. I'm getting ready to sneeze myself. Funny that I'm talking about that particular drug and I'm getting ready to sneeze. He would come out and the first time, and this was a regular thing, the first time that he did it, he came out and he had a stack of papers and he gave them to his manager or whoever it was. And they actually thought it was a joke. Like they were like, what could possibly, like when they looked in the room and they saw that the coke was gone and the liquor was gone, they thought, what human being could actually produce any good music when they're under the influence of that much chemical, you know, substances? And his manager said he took the papers and he went to like Elton John had a partner. It might have been Bernie Taupin, it was his partner, but maybe that's who the manager went and took the songs to. And of course, Elton John was exhausted. Like he would leave and then he would go crash. And he was known as being kind of a mean, ornery bastard anyway. Like, again, people tend to stereotype like, well, if you're gay, that means you're not, you know, you must be effeminate or whatever. Elton John was known as being like a very ornery guy. Like, you know, like I don't mean like a physically like a tough guy fighting wise. Maybe he was, but as far as like his personality, he was known as being very ornery and hard to get along with. So as far as people thinking like, you know, well, if you're homosexual, it must mean that you just have no spine. Well, that was not the case with Elton John. Elton John emerged out of there with those papers and he gave them to the very first time he did that, he gave them to people and they thought it was a joke. And they were like, yeah, right. And they looked at it and they were like, this stuff is good enough to be put on an album right now. Like that's how talented he is. And it would probably be amazing. You know, a lot of people have a way of fooling themselves into thinking they do their best work when they're inebriated. What's sad is he probably would have done way better work had he done it sober. And he did really good work inebriated, but he probably would have done better work sober. The point I'm getting at again here is like, you know, music video, the more mediums that were open, the more it allowed people to express themselves in a way that if they were just on an album, you know, you might not get. Like, for example, a lot of people, if they listen to Prince or they look, if they I would go so far as to say if they just listened to Prince, they might think he had a little bit of Little Richard to him. Well, Little Richard, okay, when he was around, the only thing that they had was maybe like, a live performance on TV that you could get, or a radio performance. What I'm getting at is, unless you were one of those rare people that had a TV, you probably really didn't know what Little Richard looked like. Well, Little Richard actually, kind of the way he dressed and stuff is actually kind of reminiscent of Prince. And actually, the way they did their hair and stuff is actually very similar. And I would argue again, Prince has a little bit of his sound too, a little bit. Though Prince's is more, electrified. But where I'm going with this is, Little Richard was homosexual. Had people seen Little Richard more with more exposure, more people probably would have jumped to the conclusion or said, oh, he looks very flamboyant. Look at the way he dresses. Quite possibly he's homosexual. Because again, like, people have a stereotype in their mind. Well, think about Prince. Just think about Prince for a minute. He came out on stage wearing almost always the color that's associated with him, purple. Purple has historically been a woman's color, a feminine color. I like the color purple. So I'm not, it's a good book too, Color Purple. But anyway, the point I'm making is, for a very long time, like, men wearing purple would not have been looked at as being very masculine. Prince was also very, very slightly built. When we think of people who are masculine, we think of big, burly, tough guys. Prince also had a high voice. So did Little Richard. But what I'm getting at is, a lot of times when we think of masculine men, we think of deep voices, not high voices. What I'm getting at is, MTV particularly, it opened up the doors for a lot of these guys where if you wouldn't have been able to see them, you wouldn't have had any concept of what they looked like. For people to see them and kind of make judgment calls for themselves, because the whole thing about Prince wasn't gay. Prince probably had more women than he could count. But had it been 20 years earlier, when Little Richard had been performing, 20, 30 years, whatever. I think Little Richard was late 50s. People might have looked at Prince and seen him on a one-off and gone, well, I bet that guy is gay. And he wasn't gay. That was just the image he presented. That was the image he put forth. And again, what you have to remember is, like, masculinity is like any other, I'm trying to think of the word. It's like any other sort of trait. Very rarely do things like that stay static. At some point in time, things change. And another good example of the MTV generation for that is David Bowie. David Bowie was very androgynous. He almost looked like, sometimes David Bowie, it was hard to tell, I think, for people to determine whether or not he was a man or a woman. And that, again, you got to remember, though, that was part of his shtick. It wasn't like that was done accidentally. That was part of his shtick, because David Bowie's music is so experimental and so strange that he wanted to appear unconventional. And I would argue again, sort of like in other lectures I've done, if you guys have had me in English classes before, one of the things I think David Bowie wanted audiences to do was he wanted them to question what he was, so that it would ultimately make them question what they were. Because you see, here's the whole thing, the funny way this works. And I'm speaking as a male, Okay, here's the funny thing about this is, and I don't know what this would be called. I am sure this is a theory somewhere in your book. If I'm a male, okay, if I shouldn't say if I'm a male, I'm a male. If I like something that's considered effeminate, does that make me less masculine? You understand what I mean? Sorry, my speaker's on over here. Does that make me less masculine if I like things that are effeminate? So, like, for example, like I said earlier, let's say and you guys have seen me. You guys who had me as a teacher. If I come in and I'm wearing a purple shirt and a purple tie, does that make me less masculine? To some people, it might. To me, it doesn't. I don't think about it. I don't wear pink stuff because I don't think I look good in it. If I thought I looked good in something pink, I wouldn't hesitate to wear it. I just don't think I look good in that color. Okay. What I'm getting at here is this, though. There's got to be a theory, and I don't know that I've ever come across it, or what it would be called, where heterosexual men have a conscious concern that if that, and it may not even just have to be heterosexual men. I'm just using myself as an example, though. Heterosexual men are concerned that if they like something that the consensus dubs as being feminine, that makes them feminine. Like, I'll give you an example. When my friend was in high school, now this is obviously highly inappropriate. It's no curse words or anything, but there was a guy we were friends with, me and my buddy, and he was telling us this story about how he ran across a guy we went to high school with. Now this was a couple years after we had graduated, and he said the guy came up to him and started talking to him and noticed that my friend bought the same kind of cigarettes that he did. And he said, hey, and they knew each other, like, not well. You have to remember, after high school, like, you guys, you don't see people very often that you went to high school with, unless you are friends with them or you go to college with them or something. Like, if you go back home, you just don't see people as often. Well, he knew him, and the guy said, well, we smoke the same cigarettes. And the guy I'm friends with was like, okay. And he was like, so we should get together sometime. And my friend was like, okay. And he didn't understand, like, what made like, they hadn't seen each other. They weren't really friends. They hadn't, they hadn't talked to each other probably in like 2 or 3 years. My friend thought it was strange that a guy who he hadn't seen in years would use the guise, I guess would be the word, guise, the guise of smoking the same cigarettes as my friend, and thinking that somehow they should hang out because of that. And so when my friend was telling us this story, my other friend jumped in, and like I said, this is inappropriate, but I'm making a point. My friend said, man, that's gay. And he goes, that's Elton John gay. That's exactly how he said it. And my point is, again, it's one of those things where if you suddenly like something that most people consider effeminate, does that make you somehow less masculine? Because I think I actually said at the time, like, man, I like Elton John. Like, I don't consider that making me any less, masculine. I like his music. So my point is that this guy I'm friends with, he took something that people had already, stigmatized as being not masculine, as being a guy who's homosexual. Well, again, now bisexual. Again, somebody who, was not considered masculine, and he lowered the value of that person just because of their sexuality. Well, I think, again, what I'm trying to get at is, I think people like a David Bowie, I think what he wanted people to do was look at him and kind of question him and question his music. And in the process, it would make them question themselves. Because if you like something that appears bizarre or out of the ordinary, well, does that make you bizarre or out of the ordinary? A lot of times people like to do that. They like to make people question themselves. I talk about that a lot in literature class. Books don't exist without readers. Music doesn't exist without listeners. You understand what I mean? Like, if nobody ever reads your book, then whatever you had to say never sees the light of day. If no one listens to your music, then whatever you were singing or rapping or humming or playing, it never reaches anybody's ears. But if what you do, and David Bowie he died not long ago. I think he died about 2 years ago. He sold millions of records. One of my friends worships David Bowie. I mean, he thinks David Bowie's like the greatest musician ever. I never liked his music. I never got it, I guess. Again, I'm not judging anybody for liking it or disliking it. I never got it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where the level of exposure we have to people now allows us that ability to kind of be a little more judgmental about whether or not somebody is masculine or feminine as a performer. I mean, I'll go back to Prince. Like, man, when I hear Prince play guitar, I don't care if he's a woman, a man. I don't care if he's transgender. I don't care. That dude could straight up play. I don't care about what he is. I don't care about his sexual orientation. I don't care. But not everybody's that way. You understand? I mean, some people, they care more about the image or how the image makes them look than they do about the music. Another thing that would bordered on your generation, it was part of my generation. Heavy metal music got really popular. And heavy metal music got really popular among people who were probably a little younger than you all, teenagers. Because what are teenagers? They're rebellious. They're angry. Okay? And that's what heavy metal music tapped into. I mean, go back, like Metallica today, and again, I don't know that that's you guys, type of music. I'm sure you know who they are. But what I mean is, if you don't listen to them, that's fine. But if you listen to Metallica today, and I know their lead singer has been in and out of rehab, so I don't know that they've done anything in a little while. But you listen to a Metallica album that's been put out in the last few years, then go back and listen to like Ride the Lightning that came out like 1985, or Master of Puppets, probably 86, or Kill 'Em All. That was their first album. That was like 82 or 83. It is night and day. I mean, their old stuff is just like, and the lyrics are like often, very, I don't want to say violent, but they're angry. They're just angry. And the music just sounds angry. Ozzy Osbourne's another one, who was really popular, and his music just sounded angry. Megadeth was another group, and their lead singer had that real raspy voice, and they just sounded angry. The point I'm getting at is, again, and I think this lecture is really keyed in more on music. I wanted to talk a little bit about Romaine, but I probably won't. I may actually do another lecture about her, because I think she's very interesting, and I think she's very underrated. The book is old, admittedly. The book that I gave you the PDFs of, there's some questions on the quiz about it. But that book's about 20 years old, so it is dated. But I think a lot of the stuff she was doing then is still relevant now. But let me get back to the music, because I am actually going to do a separate lecture on Romaine. A lot of music became popular by tapping into gender roles. I think this is a good place to try to wrap up. Think about teenagers, even like, you guys' generation, totally different than the one I grew up in. Okay. Teenagers are always pissed off. They just are. Okay. Like, I remember when, and I'm laughing about it now because I guess it's karma. I was such a little, I almost cursed there. I was such a pain in the ass as a teenager. I don't know how my parents kept from kicking my ass from one end of that house to the other. I was such a pain. And a lot of you are probably going, Root, you're still a pain. Yeah, I probably am. My wife probably says the same thing. But I've mellowed a lot. I remember when I lived with my wife before we were married, and I lived with her kids and they were teenagers, and I thought, oh my God, this is absolutely God's way of getting me back for the way I was as a teenager, because they were just so annoying all the time. And they always had a smart ass answer for anything I said. And the thing was, at first it used to make me angry, because you got to remember this too. In my defense, I was a young man, and I come from a small family. I mean, I just have a brother and two parents. Like, I never knew any of my grandparents. I never had really any aunts or uncles that I was close with. I was closer with the family down the street, literally, than I was with my own relatives. Just as a quick example of masculinity, actually, my best friend, the family I'm talking about growing up, his sister and her whole family were killed by a tractor trailer. Hit them head on going 80 miles an hour. Their bodies were basically burned and destroyed beyond recognition. Like, they were going to, speaking of, and it was this weekend, I think it was 3 years ago this weekend, they were going to their families for Easter, and they got hit head on by this truck. And the family was calling the cell phones and calling the cell phones and calling their cell phones and not getting any answer, and not hearing anything. And it was like, they started calling the highway patrols, and it was like 2 or 3 days before they found out that it was them, that because their bodies had been so destroyed, like they couldn't identify them, and their vehicle had been just destroyed. So like they didn't even, I don't even think they had like a license plate or anything. Anyway, where I'm going with this is, I didn't grow up with a very close family. And so, when I went to the funeral, I was in the very back pew bawling my eyes out, because I had never experienced a loss other than my dog, who you all have heard me talk about, and I loved him too. And I cried when he died, but it wasn't the same thing. To think about, a family, an entire family, being just, I mean, the only word I can think of is just decimated. And again, that was just a family friend. So what brought me to that was talking about my wife's kids and about how they used to drive me nuts. Well, in my defense, I was 28 years old, and I had never had kids of my own. I'd never really had to be around kids other than myself and my brother. And we were roughly the same age, and we had the same parents. And so we were pissed off about the same things. The point I'm getting at is, certain kinds of music, it taps into certain groups of people. Okay. And I think this is also a really good place to kind of leave a almost like a thought point. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to put this on Moodle. I'm not going to make you write an essay on it. It's just something I think I would like for you to ponder. Do we stereotype people based on the music they listen to, or do we stereotype music based on who we think listens to it? So in other words, here's the whole thing. I love rap music. Now, I'm not saying I love all of it, but I love rap music. I am like the palest skinned white guy you're ever going to see. I probably am not fitting the target audience most people think of as being a guy who likes rap music. But that doesn't mean I don't like it. But one of the things I've also talked to you guys about in class that we've had discussions about, I think maybe one difference between me and probably who a lot of rap music is aimed at is I'm a lot more interested in what it says and how it says it than a lot of younger people are who are just, out there, getting down to the beat. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've said it before, and Raekwon from the Wu-Tang Clan said it perfectly. When I want to go out to the club and shake my ass, I go out to the club and shake my ass. But right now I want something deeper. And that's always been my philosophy. And I'm 40 years old. I don't go out to the club and shake my ass anymore. Okay. I don't do that. Maybe when I was, my early, my late teens, early to mid 20s, I was doing that. But right now, when I listen to something, I want something on a deeper plane. And what I'm getting at is a lot of people who listen to rap, that's not their thing. They like the beat, they like the hook, if there's a catchy hook to a song, they like it. They're not, and I'm not saying everybody, I'm saying a lot of times. I don't think a lot of people who are rap fans, a lot of times, I don't think they place a lot of value on the lyrics. I'm not saying everybody, I'm saying a lot of people, I don't think they do. I think they place more value on the beat. If they like the beat, then they like the song. And the lyrics could be totally trash. I mean, literally, they could be trash. Like I could write the lyrics in 5 minutes. And it would still be popular because of the beat. Well, where I'm going with that is, do we do the same thing with something like heavy metal music? I mean, do we look at people who listen to heavy metal and think they all need to have long hair and, be angry young white men, most likely? Because again, I'm going to tell you, I like heavy metal music too. And I don't think I fit the stereotype there. But I will say this, what's probably odd. When I listen to rap, and I'm going to end on this because here I am. I'm kind of trying to compartmentalize this as I go because I've never actually thought about it. This is something we should be doing in class. We should be thinking about things and being self-aware. That's what teaches us. It's kind of odd for me because I sit here and I think about rap music and I think about how I value the lyrics. And the reason I think I do is because when I think of rap, I think of poetry. But when I think of like heavy metal, I don't. And so with me, with heavy metal, it probably has, I probably am more drawn to what a heavy metal song sounds like than I am the lyrics of it. Whereas with rap, I'm probably more drawn to the lyrics of it than I am the beat. Now, don't get me wrong. I like a hot beat. If a song has a beat I can't stand, I'm not going to listen to it even if I like the lyrics, just to be clear. But what I'm getting at is I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that I look at every musical category and treat it the same way, if that makes sense. It's sort of like, again, like, I'll wrap up with an example I've used in class before, and this really is where I'll wrap up. if you go onto YouTube and you look up Shawshank Redemption opera, okay, what you're going to see is a scene where Morgan Freeman is narrating, and the movie takes place in jail. And one of the inmates manages to get into the warden's office, and he takes an opera record and he puts it on the record player and he plays it. And he locks the warden out of his office and he plays it over the loudspeaker. And everybody in the jail yard stops working and starts listening to the music. And Morgan Freeman comes on and he's narrating and he goes, to this day, I don't know what those two Italian women were singing about. And to tell you the truth, I don't want to know. He said, I'd like to think they were singing about something so beautiful that words can't describe it. And it kind of makes your heart ache to think about it. And where I'm going with this is, I'm not sure that a lot of times we really go into listening to music thinking that we need a message or we need to understand or even relate to the people that we're listening to. I mean, like I said, I mean, I'm a white guy from Virginia. That doesn't mean I can't listen to Eazy-E and appreciate it. I'm not from Compton. I haven't lived the life that he did, but that doesn't mean I can't listen to it and appreciate it. And what I'm getting at is, I think that for anybody, whether you're female, whether you're male, whether you associate yourself with being a masculine gender or a feminine gender, or even if you are transgender, even if you may identify differently on a different day. What I'm getting at is, maybe we put a little too much value on how the music we listen to emphasizes our gender, instead of just listening to something based on whether or not we enjoy it. What I'm getting at is, again, that idea of how we're perceived is reflected by what we do and how we behave. If I'm driving down the road listening to Katy Perry at full volume, chances are, especially like if I'm on Claflin's campus, like if I'm driving around and people, especially people who might know me, guarantee they're going to laugh. It's a guarantee, right? I mean, don't you think it's a guarantee they're probably going to laugh? My point is why should I care if I like it? And it's the same way as, if a man likes to wear pink, whether he's homosexual, heterosexual, masculine gender, feminine gender, transgender, why does it matter? And again, what I'm hoping I'm getting across to you with these lectures is that so much of this stuff is synthetic. So much of it is arbitrary. It's fabricated. These gender rules and gender roles, I meant to say rules. These gender rules and gender roles, they're fabricated. They're created. What I'm getting at is they're not real. They're somebody's arbitrary creation in order to keep groups separate. And it may sound idealistic of me, because I'm coming up on an hour and I'm going to end now. It may sound idealistic of me to say this, but I think now more than ever, with what's going on in the world, that the keeping us apart thing needs to stop, and we need to just come together. And the way to come together is accepting that, we're different. Everybody's different. And man, if everybody was the same, that would be like eating a hamburger every day. Sooner or later, you'd get bored. If everybody was the same, don't you think you'd get bored after a while? I mean, I think you would. So again, the point I'm getting at is I think this was a good chapter because I think a lot of people, particularly people like me who are really into music, they look at music as a way to, identify, whether it's identify with the musician or whether it's to kind of identify themselves. And I think that for some people, they let what they think they're supposed to like become more important than what they actually like. And so you may have a student on campus who really likes, I don't know, Nirvana, but they don't feel like they can wear a Nirvana shirt because they're in a predominantly HBCU. Maybe you have a kid at a predominantly white private college who really likes Drake, but doesn't feel like he can wear a Drake shirt because he's at a predominantly white school. What I'm getting at is I think that a lot of times we let what we think we should like keep us from actually liking what we want to like. And I think that goes across the board. I think this chapter crosses over with the color of shirt you wear, the type of glasses you wear, type of haircut you have, the length of your fingernails, the tone of your skin. We look at what a lot of times what the world likes and not what we like. And so that's where I think a good ending point is for this lecture is that, if it weren't for some group of people, and I don't know who the first one was, but if it weren't for some group of people looking back at those 1920s African American blues guys and going, damn, those guys were skilled. I want to do that. That attention maybe never would have been drawn back to them, which is a shame. It's a shame that the dominant culture has to do that. And that could also bring us into appropriation. Were they appropriating? Were they stealing from them? That's up for debate. Just like saying, were the Beastie Boys appropriating rap hip hop culture? That's up for debate. I mean, if they were respecting it and they were respected in it, then most people probably would say no. But if they were just riffing it to make money, to make a quick buck, to gain some fame, most people probably would say yes. Again, that's a different topic for a different day. But what I think, again, is that all this stuff overlaps. And too often what happens is we let what society tells us we should like or we should favor or that fits us become what we fall into instead of giving stuff a chance that we historically, for whatever reason, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's race, or I'm sorry, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender, whether it's culture, whether it's sex, whatever it may be, we let people pigeonhole us. And I think that music is a great example of that. That it can be a real unifier if people wanted it to be that. And I think that's what music's intended to do. I think it's intended to bring people together. And maybe something I said in this lecture will make you all go look up some stuff that you're not familiar with and check it out. And maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. But if you like it, then that's just something else to add to your repertoire. And if you don't, it's still something you've exposed yourself to. Okay. So on that note, I'm going to end. Be sure you take your quiz before the end of the week. Sunday, obviously. And I will have your quizzes graded here within like the next day or so. I've just had a lot on my plate, so I will get to them. And I will go through them and check them individually because I know that sometimes Moodle is very nitpicky with how it grades. So I always go back through and check. Okay. So on that note, take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Have a good Easter weekend. And I will be talking with you all.